For this period of our lecture, we're going to concentrate on the monastic movement in the later medieval period. The early Christian monasteries really began to decline after the reforms of the Irish Church in the 12th century. The Irish Church had evolved differently during the first millennium to those areas that were within the boundaries of the Roman Empire. Because the empire had become Christianized quite early on, it had allowed the movement there, the church and the monastic movement there, to evolve differently basically than it had in Ireland. And the church on what we would know as the continent really had managed to develop quite highly sophisticated and developed structures and systems in administration and organization, etc. But that never happened here. However, with the reforms of the church in the 12th century, that significantly impacted on the monastic movement and on the church movement in Ireland at that point. So basically, by the late 11th century, the lax, I suppose, administration and organisation of the church in Ireland came under scrutiny, and following a series of synods then, the parishes and the dioceses of Ireland were established, and in tandem with this, the small, loosely organised monasteries also warranted attention. So the reformation and the reorganisation of these monasteries occurred principally with the arrival to Ireland of what we know of as the Continental or the Reform orders, and that would refer to the Augustinian order and the Cistercian order. I suppose one of the most significant differences between the two types of monastic movement, the early Christian movement and the Reform orders, really is to be found in the layout and the organisation of the monasteries. The layout of the later monasteries is completely different to anything that would have been seen in Ireland up to this point. So, for example, when Mellifont was established in County Louth about 1142, it's referred to as An Monaster Moor, or the Great Monastery, and that's the colloquial name for the monastery, and it really indicates that up to that point in the 1140s it was absolutely by far the most significant structure that would have been seen in the country up to that period in the monastic movement. I suppose also we've seen from Clonmacnoise how the early Christian monasteries were usually a series of oratories located within an enclosure, sometimes not even within an enclosure. We would associate high crosses and round towers and the small church oratories with that type of period and those types of buildings as well. But for the later medieval period, we must think now of the very formalized and very organized monasteries. So we've some photographs here that will, I suppose, help to focus the mind on the layout of these as well. The monasteries of the Reform order are principally laid out in a square, and they are organised around the central area, which is known as the cloister garse or garden, and this was usually used as an herb garden, and the walkways here would have been covered, and really the covered walkways were used for access. It's how the monks made their way from one part of the building to the next, basically. The four walks of the cloister are surrounded again by what we would refer to as the claustral buildings. So usually situated to the north of the cloister, we have the church. The church is generally cruciform in shape. It is facing east, so orientated on an east-west axis, and the cruciform shape gives the arms of the cross, and it also gives space for additional chapels, and these chapels then would have been used for additional services and for private prayer for the monks. If we look at the photograph here of Jerpoint Abbey, we can see the chancel of the monastery, which housed the main altar area. And in this photograph, we can see that there are 3 medieval effigies in this location as well. 2 of those effigies are of men who were abbots of the monastery. One is Felix, so you can see a little bit more detail of the effigy of Felix here. Felix was the founding abbot of Jerpoint, and he later became bishop of the diocese of Ossory. The next effigy is that of William. He's just lying to the west of Felix, and William was once a monk at Jerpoint and later bishop of Cork. So both of these 13th century effigies, very different in style though, you can see as well. And any of these monasteries that you visit, you will tend to find these effigies in place, particularly in the chancel, sometimes in the transepts or just under the crossing tower. The third effigy that is here is probably a little bit more unusual. So this is an early 14th century effigy of a layman, Thomas. And Thomas was possibly some sort of maybe a tribal leader in the locality. The later cross that's seen in the photograph here marks a 20th century burial plot. And this, I suppose, really is a reminder that many of these medieval monasteries remained as sacred spaces for many centuries after the communities had left. And these were used then by the local lay community to bury their dead. So many local families would retain close and tangible links to these medieval buildings as well. On the eastern side of the cloister, this was generally used as an administrative wing and a dormitory located on the upper level. So often you would have maybe a chapter house, a prior's room, a day room. Depending on the order, there would be a little bit of difference in that layout. The south range was generally used as a service wing, housing a calefactory or a warming room, a refectory or a dining room, and a kitchen. And then the west range completes the enclosure, and the lower level here was often used as a storage area with more dormitories located on the upper level. A drainage system, often quite an elaborate drainage system, then ran under the south end of the dormitories. So for many of us, this would be what we think of when we look at a monastery. We think that that's the whole of the structure, but in actual fact that is not the case, because there was ancillary buildings which were really integral to the efficient functioning of the monastery. So from the aerial photograph here of Kells Priory, so Kells is an Augustinian priory located in County Kilkenny, and these photographs allow us to clearly see how the monastery was surrounded by two walls. The inner wall encloses the monastery and the main ancillary buildings, such as the kitchen, the infirmary, a bakehouse, a brewhouse, a mill and a workshop, along with gardens, vegetable patches, and other enclosures would have been dotted here. So where we see green, open green space, that would have been probably quite a cluttered space really. So they would have made use of all the spaces that were situated here within the inner enclosure. Access to the inner enclosure was controlled by the bridge tower, and that bridge tower was conserved by our National Monuments team in 2019. The outer wall encloses what in Kells was referred to as the Prior's Ville. Now, not all medieval monasteries had such elaborate walls and defences, but I suppose these remains here just really indicate how vulnerable a monastic community could be in the later medieval period. So it's not unusual that Kells has these walls. A lot of the monasteries would have had them, but what's unusual at Kells here is that these walls have survived up until the modern period. You can see that we have a number of towers dotted along the outer wall and the inner wall, but we'll look particularly at the outer wall here. And those towers had three functions. Primarily, they were used for defence, obviously, but they also would have been basically rented out by a family. And because they were rented out then, each family would have lived within the tower. So that's the second function. It was used for habitation. And then thirdly, a little bit of agriculture. So each family were given a space directly in front of the tower within the ville in which they could raise some domestic animals and obviously, you know, grow some vegetables. And access to this space, this whole ville, was accessed by a fortified gate on the eastern side of the ville, which we can see here in the photograph. I suppose the other main difference between the monasteries of the early Christian period and the later medieval was that the later monasteries were organised within a very tight framework of rules and structures, and this is particularly true of the Cistercian order, and is probably one of the main reasons why the Cistercians really were so successful throughout this period. The strict rules and regulations followed by the monasteries allowed the monasteries to retain a core identity and a strict framework within which to develop their monasteries, but at the same time each monastery was regarded as an independent unit. Each year, the Cistercians held a general chapter which was situated in France. So the abbot from every house was expected to attend. Obviously, because of travel distances, that didn't always happen. And then if there was political agitation or war in a particular area, monasteries could have been given an exemption. But it certainly does indicate that the abbots from these houses were would have met quite often. And we can only imagine that, like any of us, we're only human, they would have communicated any disasters that would happen with any of their buildings, etc. So obviously this was a place where ideas could have been exchanged, and things that went wrong could have been discussed as well. So it just gives us this idea of a very kind of cohesive structure and organization, and a very tight framework within which they functioned. The Cistercian monasteries were more spatial in their organisation, so they sought remote areas to aid in their contemplative lifestyle and to help to fulfil their ideals of self-sufficiency. So if you think of somewhere like the situation of Mellifont Abbey in County Louth, or the location of Kilcooley Abbey in County Tipperary, in some cases towns later built up around these monasteries, such as at Baltinglass Abbey in County Wicklow, or at Graignamanagh on the Kilkenny-Carlow border. But many other religious houses had monastic, or religious organisations had monastic houses in Ireland in the period from the mid-12th century onwards, and examples of these are the Cistercians, the Augustinians, as I've said, but also the Benedictines, the Dominicans, the Franciscans, the Carmelites, the Order of Tyrone, the Knights Templar, convents of nuns, Knights Hospitallers. Other religious orders established hospitals and hospices and secular colleges, and these were all in existence in medieval Ireland. Some of these settled in urban areas, some in the rural landscape. Some had large monasteries and tracts of land associated with them. Some continually struggled to survive. But each one has left an impact on our landscape and on our heritage. Many of these monasteries have left us with beautiful buildings, intricate architectural and engineering achievements, and art and sculpture that excites and inspires us. The monasteries continued to function until the period of 1536 to 1541, when they were dissolved by order of King Henry VIII. Monasteries were ordered to close, some monks were forcibly removed, some had left prior to the dissolution, and then, I suppose in an effort to be seen as less forceful, some were offered pensions. But whatever the situation, the monasteries had no choice, they were forced to close. The lands and the buildings were leased to loyal supporters of the crown, and for many monasteries this marked the beginning of the end of the actual structures. And these ruins dot our landscape today, and the majority of those are designated as national monuments in state care, and as such they are preserved and protected under legislation. Others had a slightly different post-dissolution history, and one that stands out in this regard is Tintern Abbey in County Wexford. Tintern was founded as a Cistercian monastery around about the year 1200, and it functioned as such until it was dissolved in 1536. Shortly after this, it came into the possession of the Coakley family, and then it was turned into a fortified dwelling and developed as a landed estate. The Coakley family retained ownership of the building until the 1950s, when the abbey and the remaining lands were donated to the Irish state. So Tintern is among the very rare examples in the Irish landscape where the monastic building and lands can be traced through just, two distinct ownership periods from the late 13th up until the 20th centuries. And the story of Tintern is one of constant reinvention and transformation, where each successive generation left their mark. It's also a story of continuity, where the lands and the abbey remained as a complete unit for in excess of 700 years. The conjectural reconstructions that we include here indicate the many changes that the old abbey buildings underwent in the later history. During the post-dissolution period, small communities continued to function. Some novitiates were established, but the monastic movement was effectively banned in Ireland from the mid-16th century until Catholic emancipation in 1832. In 1830, a community of monks were expelled from the Abbey of Melleray in France after the French Revolution. A colony of these Cistercian monks, now known as Trappists of the Strict Observance, made their way to Ireland with the intention of establishing a monastery here. They were successful in their endeavour, and in 1832 they established Mt Melleray Abbey near to Cappoquin in County Waterford. That monastery is still in existence, and for the last section of our talk we're actually going to hear about the monastic movement in the modern period from some members of the community at Mt Melleray Abbey.
The Almighty works marvels for me, holy His name, His mercy is from age to age, on those who fear Him. He puts forth His arm and strength, and scatters the downhearted. He casts away from their thrones, and raises the lowly. He fills the starving with good gifts, sends their children. He protects Israel, His servant, remembering His mercy, the mercy promised to our forebears, for Abraham and his line forever. Praise the Father, the Son, and Holy Spirit, both now and forever. The God who is, who was, and is to come, and the end of the age.
Hello, my name is Father Richard Purcell, and I'm the abbot here in Mt Melleray Abbey. Mt Melleray is Ireland's oldest living monastery. All around the country we have ruins of old monasteries, which once were occupied by monks, but here in Mt Melleray we're a living monastery, where monks continue to live, work and pray in the place in which they have done for over 200 years. In fact, the story of Mt Melleray goes back to the 1830s, when Irish and English men who had become monks in that monastery of Melleray in Brittany were expelled and came to Ireland seeking refuge. Here on the slopes of the Knockmealdown Mountains, the monks built a monastery from what was barren land. Today there are 8 monks in this community living here, praying 7 times a day in the church, working together, meditating. The life of a monk is in fact a balance between 3 things: prayer, work and study. And here in this monastery we do all 3. The monks gather 7 times a day in the monastery church for the offices, or as St. Benedict calls it, the work of God. At other times they are occupied in work around the community, or indeed in private prayer and study. We have a large farm here where there are about 250 cows. We also have a large guest house where we welcome people to come and stay for a period of up to a week. But many people come to Mt Melleray to pray and to experience the atmosphere of peace here in the place. The monks at Mt Melleray Abbey are Cistercian monks. We follow the rule of St. Benedict. St. Benedict lived in the 6th century, and he wrote a rule for monks in which he set out how the monastic life should be lived. That rule details all the various aspects of how new monks are to be received, how the day is to be structured, what sort of clothes the monks are to wear, how they relate to one another, how they elect an abbot, how they do their work, and so on. And here in Mt Melleray today we continue that tradition of monastic life. The life of the monk is basically one in which we seek God. And we seek God not as hermits, but in a community. And so we live with our brothers here in this place, doing our best to live the gospel values. St. Benedict tells the monks that nothing should be preferred to the work of God. And so our whole day is centred around the rhythm of the offices in the church. When the monks are working, when the monks are praying, at all times, their focus is on seeking God in all that they do. One of the first wings that the monks put up was the building which is today used as the guest house. That was built in the 1840s and is where the community lived until the rest of the monastery was built. The original church, which was built in the 1830s, was knocked down a century later and replaced by this much larger church. More recently, about 10 years ago, the monks built a new wing of accommodation of cells, 25 rooms, which is pictured here on the left.
Well, what do we have to offer? I suppose the main thing we have to offer here is hospitality. And this cafe is a place where people, I hope, feel welcome. And a place where they can have an enjoyable cup of tea, hopefully a good cup of tea and a good cup of coffee. And we try as well to have this good homemade produce. We try to do something simple because we're not well up, and we feel that people come up here, they're satisfied with just a good cup of coffee and maybe a good scone. There's a lot of chatting goes on here, you know, and I think that's possibly one of the great things about a place like this. They come up to Melleray for lots of reasons, but they may go over to say their prayers, go to confession, light the candles, they might walk around a bit, they go into the museum, they go into the shop, and then they like to sit down and have a cup of tea and coffee. They might like to talk to somebody, they might like to talk to me. And it's a place where I meet a lot of people, or people come to meet me here even when you know, during the week when there's very few people around and somebody wants to meet me, I say come up to the cafe at 2:30, and very often the two of us will have the cafe maybe for ourselves. So it's, as I said, every evening you open there's somebody important comes. We certainly cater for families, and we love to see families coming, and we have ice cream and all that sort of thing for them. And as for groups, then we cater for groups, and we get a lot of groups that come, kind of organised groups that we will do sandwiches for them, and we'll do them say when we're even in the morning when we're not open. If they want to come and they want to get a cup of tea at 11 o'clock and a scone or sandwich, then we'll do that for groups. We do it for different groups. We haven't it, I suppose, very well promoted yet, but we get quite a number of school groups that come here, and they would come maybe for a day's retreat, which would mean they'd come in the morning and they'd attend prayers, and I might give them a little talk or a tour of the church, or we might have a little dialogue, and go to the shop, and then they come here, and it's nearly time for them to go home then. We'd have active age groups, we'd have parish groups, we'd have Legion of Mary groups, we'd have tourists, we'd have pilgrim groups. So there's a big sort of lot of people, different groups that come, yeah.